Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal by Francis Summers Cox. Today is chapter 4, The Lord of the Sea Returns. The next afternoon, Lahia helped Abraham out of the hut. They walked slowly, arm in arm, across the muddy yard with its rough stone palace, the only two-story building, and a scattering of huts for cooking and brewing and storage. Huts for wives and for slaves. They made their way through the chickens and the new lambs, the clutter of cooking pots and water pots and beer pots, of grinding stones and grain baskets and water skins. Many people were still out of the compound on their different duties, but everyone was there, all the children, their half-sisters and half-brothers, and the house slaves, all of them cheered and clapped. The womenfolk, including Granny Esther, his father's mother, and Makeda, and his father's 7 other wives, gave their ear-splitting thrill of joy. Even Abraham's 2 least favorite stepmothers, who had a habit of making pointed remarks about slaves and the kunama and people with dark skins, when he and his mother or sister were in earshot, joined in the congratulations. Abraham blinked and bit his lips with happiness. Not bad for the youngest boy, not bad for a grandson of the kunama, the slave people. Very, very carefully, the 2 children clambered up the huge, rough stones of the yard wall, sat themselves on the top, and looked around them. Below them, the hillside fell steeply down to the plain. A royal compound lay at the end of a high, narrow ridge, St. Mary's Hill, and on 2 of its sides there was a sheer drop. On the 3rd side was a gradual slope down to the church of St. Mary, and on the 4th, a steep path down to the town. Round most of the bottom of the hill swarmed Dubarra, his father's capital, a town of long, low stone and mud houses with heavy flat roofs, here and there a thatched round hut, all crowded together higgledy-piggledy, the alleyways and the yards and even the roofs bright green with wild plants at this time of the big rains. The town stretched right across from St. Mary's Hill to the deep red gash of the Mereb River, where the thin red track that led to the sea snaked off across the country of Logan and northward across the stony plains. "Over there!" cried Abraham, pointing, "just by the King's Hill. They were stampeding toward those fields there, so I ran upstream and they followed." "And they certainly did. That must be where you fell in, and the old she-elephant followed you." Lahia squeezed his shoulder, and he squeezed hers. They sat and watched evening begin to fall over their father's town, over the fields and pastures of the country of Logan, and the plains and mountains of his kingdom that stretched out toward the wild lands in the west, toward the seacoast in the northeast, and toward the kingdom of his father's overlord, the Ras of Tigray, to the south. "Look," cried Lahia, "the cows and goats are on their way home. No excitements with the elephants this time." And they sat watching the livestock of Logan and of their own palace, tiny as toys, plodding their way home from all over the surrounding countryside. Suddenly Abraham stiffened. Up the path from the town came something that flashed in the sun. Spearheads, shields shining with silver gilt. "It's father!" They scrambled down from the wall, not caring this time about Abraham's aching joints, and rushed to the hut where Makeda sat on the open step of her long white dress, spinning cotton. "Father is here!" They left her putting her things away and dashed to the gate. The long line of horsemen and load bearers was reaching the top of the slope, all mixed up with the cows and goats returning from their day's grazing. At the head of the line rode Phares, the Lord of the Sea, on his tall chestnut stallion Thunder. His cotton shirt, breeches, and cloak, that should have been white, were dark with sweat and dried mud, and the tiny braids plaited back along his head were gray with dust. The 2 children stood by the gate, wondering if they dared come nearer. But suddenly the Lord of the Sea saw them, threw his spears and shield to the horsemen next to him, and cantered across. Then he rained down and pulled the boy up into his arms. "Hey, little monk, you left your prayers and saved us from a stampede." Abraham said nothing and simply hugged his father back. But then he couldn't help himself and burst out, "Oh, Father, why weren't you there when I was ill?" His father's thin, hawk-nosed face looked stern. "What kind of talk is this? How dare you question the Lord of the Sea?" For an instant, Abraham thought his father was going to push him down off Thunder's back. But then suddenly Ferris smiled. "Well, you're allowed to miss me, I suppose. Anyway, I'm back now, so pull yourself together. There was an important message from the Emperor, a matter of the tax on salt, and the Raz of Tigray wished to discuss it with me. Grown-ups business. One day you will have to deal with these things too. I have to admit, I stayed a little longer. There were lions in the district, and we had a day's hunting, but I think you will be glad of that. Hey, you, slave, fetch the special basket, and you, take the horse." Phares, the Lord of the Sea, swung down from his horse and helped Abraham down. By this time, the whole clan were standing by the gate, watching, and Granny Esther, Lahia, and Makeda with them. The watchers, from Granny Esther, who was getting very creaky, to the youngest slave child, bowed to the ground. But then 2 slaves came up, struggling with a strange load between them, a kind of basket or cage of sticks that snarled and bounced. They placed it in front of Abraham and Phares, and the boy squatted down to peer between the sticks. Inside was a lion cub, the color of a yellow melon, and about twice the size. "We killed the mother. This little fellow was left, and I had the idea of bringing him back for you. The present of a lion, for a boy with the courage of a lion." Abraham looked from his father to the basket and back again. He had forgotten his sadness and was grinning with delight at the thought that had just struck him. "Our very own lion? Just like the ones in Granny's stories about the Emperor's palace?" he asked. Phares, the Lord of the Sea, laughed and pinched Abraham's chin. "You really are a young monk. So much knowledge." But then his face grew harsh, and he turned and shouted loudly, "Are all the cattle and goats back yet? Where are their herders? There is an important and private matter to deal with. Herders and servants and slaves, leave and go about your duties. I wish my children, my chief warriors, and my wives to stay. Gather under the tree. I wish all my sons to stand by my side." The women and girls sat at his feet, and the sons stood next to him. Abraham, the youngest, was at one side of his father, and the crowd of his 19 half-brothers, right up to Gabriel Saliah, servant of the Trinity, the eldest and really a man by now, jostled for space on the other side. The chief warriors tied up their horses and stood at the back. "You all know what happened last week at the river. Abraham, my youngest son, did an act which will never be forgotten. But what, I ask, of my other sons? What did they do when the enemy came? How did they defend my cattle? How did they defend the crops and the homes of my people? They did not. If they are not able to drive off a herd of dumb animals, how can I depend on them when the lands of the Lord of the Sea are under threat? They are cowards and lazy good-for-nothings, not worthy to be called my sons. My warriors, seize them, tie them up." There was absolute stillness, not a movement, not a sound. People looked at each other in horrified bewilderment. Then the warriors started to collect straps and ropes from their horses and made their way through the girls and women to tie up the boys who were standing frozen in disbelief. Mothers and sisters were trying not to sob. Phares waited till the boy's hands were tied before he went on. "Tomorrow morning there will be a service of thanksgiving for my son's recovery in the church, and in the evening there will be a great feast in his honor. But the boys who are no longer my sons will be taken to the top of Mount Damo, where they will stay tied up and under guard at my pleasure. That's the end of chapter 4.